In August 1977, Salisbury looked like a city completely at peace. Shoppers crowded the aisles of Woolworths on Gordon Avenue, convinced the brutal Rhodesian Bush War was a distant nightmare fought only on the borders. They were deadly wrong. Hidden inside the department store's haberdashery section was a massive, time-fused bomb, planted not by hardened guerrilla soldiers but by two ordinary local schoolteachers. This is the terrifying, true revisit of the 1977 Salisbury Woolworths bombing, a catastrophic act of urban terror that shattered Rhodesia's illusions of safety, changed the course of the war, and proved that the ultimate enemy was already inside the gates. That illusion was already cracking. By the middle of 1977, the Rhodesian Bush War had been grinding on for years, and the conflict that had once been confined to the eastern and northern frontiers was creeping toward the capital itself. Guerrilla forces aligned with Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, operating out of bases in Mozambique, had begun to extend the war into the cities, into the psychological heartland of white Rhodesia, where confidence mattered as much as territory. A government that had built its legitimacy on the promise of order and safety for its citizens, promises explicitly, almost obsessively, extended to white Rhodesians, was about to discover that promise had a ceiling. On the morning of the 6th of August, 1977, the Woolworths store on Gordon Avenue was doing what it always did on a Saturday, filling up. Customers checked their bags and parcels at a counter near the entrance before heading upstairs to shop, an ordinary piece of retail choreography that, on this particular morning, placed an unattended satchel within easy reach of hundreds of unsuspecting people. Inside it was an estimated 75 pounds of high explosive, a device built not for a single target, not for a politician's car or a police convoy, but for a crowd. For maximum, indiscriminate harm at the exact moment the store would be most full, just before closing. It detonated shortly before midday. What followed was carnage stripped of any military logic. 11 people were killed. 76 more were wounded, some catastrophically. Among the dead were 2 pregnant women and a young boy. A single white family, Gillian and Donald Mayer and their mother, was wiped out together inside the building, while the father and another daughter, seated in a car just outside, lived to identify the bodies. 8 of the 11 dead were black Rhodesians, ordinary shoppers who had no stake in the politics being fought in their name from either direction. Not the Rhodesian Front's claim to defend them, nor the liberation movement's claim to liberate them. They were, simply, people buying things on a Saturday morning. Prime Minister Ian Smith called the attack barbarous, the work of men who could scarcely be described as human. It was a line calculated for a Rhodesian audience desperate for villains simple enough to hate without complication. But what made the Woolworths bombing so destabilizing, what still makes it one of the most unsettling events of the entire Bush War, decades on, was not the scale of the carnage relative to the rest of the conflict. It was the ordinariness of the men who delivered it. The 2 operatives responsible for planting the bomb were not soldiers in the way Rhodesians had trained themselves to imagine the enemy, not bushfighters in camouflage, not the bearded, AK-toting carters of propaganda reels. They were teachers. 2 men who, in another life, in a country not consumed by a war for who got to belong in it, would have spent their Saturdays marking exercise books rather than wiring a bomb to detonate among schoolchildren and pregnant mothers. After the blast, they slipped out of the city and crossed the border into Mozambique, vanishing into ZANLA's rear bases and largely out of the documented historical record altogether. That vanishing is, in its own way, the heart of this story. To understand why 2 schoolteachers carried bomb-making materials into a department store rather than a classroom, you have to understand what teaching meant inside the liberation movements of Southern Africa in the 1970s, and what it meant to be an educated black man inside Rhodesia at the same time. Teachers occupied a peculiar, charged space in colonial Rhodesia. The mission schools and government training colleges that produced them were among the only institutions through which a black Rhodesian could acquire formal status, literacy, and a salary that approached respectability, and yet that same education delivered, with brutal clarity, the full measure of the ceiling above them. A teacher could instruct African children in mathematics, English, scripture, the structure of the Commonwealth, and the glories of a settler state that would never let him vote on equal terms, never let him own land in the most productive regions, never let him rise past the rank the system had assigned to his skin. Teaching, in that sense, manufactured precisely the kind of political consciousness the Rhodesian Front feared most: literate, articulate, organized men who understood the machinery of the state intimately enough to see exactly how it excluded them. It is no historical accident that the liberation movements of the region, ZANLA among them, but the pattern recurs across SWAPO in Namibia and the ANC in South Africa, drew disproportionately from the teaching profession for political officers, recruiters, and underground operatives. Teachers had standing in their communities. They could travel between rural and urban areas without arousing the suspicion that followed unemployed young men. They were trusted to carry messages, to identify recruits, to move quietly through spaces that the security apparatus was busy watching for a different kind of enemy. A man with a satchel of exercise books was, in 1977 Salisbury, close to invisible. A man with a satchel of explosives, dressed identically, walking the same route at the same hour, could be almost as invisible too. This is the uncomfortable engine room of urban guerrilla warfare everywhere, not just in Rhodesia. The soldier who succeeds is the one who does not look like a soldier. ZANLA's strategy by 1977 had explicitly shifted toward bringing the war into the cities, understanding, correctly, as it turned out, that white Rhodesian resolve depended heavily on the perception that the war was a frontier problem, manageable, distant, and containable behind a wall of Fire Force helicopters and farm fences. A bomb in a Salisbury department store did not need to kill strategically important people to be strategically devastating. It needed only to prove that no space in the country was safe, that the war had followed white Rhodesians home into the shops where their children bought sweets. The brutal irony, of course, is that the bomb did not discriminate the way its planners might have rationalized it would. 8 of the 11 dead were black. The 2 pregnant women killed were almost certainly black Rhodesian shoppers, the very population the liberation struggle claimed to be fighting for. This is the moral knot at the center of urban terror campaigns conducted in the name of liberation. Violence engineered to terrify a ruling minority routinely consumes the colonized majority it claims to serve, because crowds in a department store do not sort themselves by the categories that matter to the people planting the bombs. What we do not know, and this absence is itself instructive, is who, specifically, these 2 men were. Unlike the carefully documented operatives of later, more mythologized liberation narratives, the Woolworths bombers exist in the historical record almost entirely as a category: 2 teachers. Rhodesian security services, fighting a war on multiple fronts and increasingly desperate to project competence, never publicly produced names, photographs, or trial records establishing precisely who they were. ZANLA's own post-war accounting of the war, shaped heavily by the political needs of an independent Zimbabwe eager to celebrate its liberation heroes without dwelling too long on civilian casualties inflicted on fellow black Rhodesians, never elevated these 2 men into the pantheon of named freedom fighters either. They are remembered, when they are remembered at all, by their profession rather than their names, a strange kind of erasure that says as much about how both sides chose to tell this war as it does about the men themselves. There is something almost unbearably modern about a terror attack whose perpetrators are known only by their day job. We live in an age that demands identity, mugshots, manifestos, biographical deep dives, and the relentless need to understand who did this and why, as though understanding were the same as making sense of it. The Woolworths bombing resists that demand entirely. 60 years of archival digging, declassified Rhodesian security files, ZANLA veteran testimony, and academic military history have not produced the names of the 2 men who planted the bomb on Gordon Avenue. What survives is the shape of the act and the outline of their cover. Educators, trusted, mobile, and unremarkable enough to carry 75 pounds of explosive into a crowded room without a second glance. That anonymity has done strange work on the bombing's place in Rhodesian and Zimbabwean memory. For white Rhodesians at the time, the facelessness of the attackers fed directly into Ian Smith's rhetorical strategy. An enemy without a name or a face is easier to dehumanize wholesale, easier to fold into a single, faceless category of terrorist that justified escalating security measures, the beat-the-bomber police sweeps that followed within weeks, and the increasingly indiscriminate suspicion directed at black Rhodesians moving through the capital's checkpoints. Roadblocks went up around African townships. Ordinary black commuters were searched, delayed, and treated as suspects for a crime almost certainly committed by 2 men who did not look, dress, or move differently from any other professional walking to work that morning. The facelessness of the actual bombers became, perversely, a license to surveil and suspect an entire population that bore no responsibility for the attack. For the liberation movement, meanwhile, the absence of named heroes meant the Woolworths bombing never quite fit into the post-war mythology of Zimbabwe's liberation struggle the way other operations did. Heroic ambushes against Rhodesian security forces, raids on white-owned farms framed as strikes against settler colonialism, even controversial operations like the downing of civilian airliners, these found their way into commemorative narratives, named cadres, hero status, and official remembrance. A bomb that killed 8 black shoppers alongside 3 white ones, planted by 2 men whose names were never publicly claimed by either side, sits awkwardly in that story. It is a piece of the war that nobody, in the decade since, has had much political incentive to fully reclaim.